Hello everyone, welcome to the Alpha Hustle. Here is a weekly analysis of Nifty and Bank Nifty on how market auctioned last week with important references and potential scenarios that may likely to play out in the indices next week. So let's quickly get started. All right, so let's start with a review of Nifty. So the one time framing to the downside continues in the month of April, where the market broke down below the March lows. However, we have seen some strong buying coming, especially during the last week to push the market higher. So one of the interesting aspect that we have been carrying for the last few months is the Jan highs of 14,765. So this is the third month in a row where the buyers failed to get a closing above this level. So we failed. We tried to probe above this zone in the month of Feb before the strong sellers came in to push the market lower, leaving a big selling tail, pretty much like 1,000 point selling tail. Even in the month of March, the buyers tried to kind of absorb the supply within the zone, who eventually failed to get a follow through above Feb highs that led the liquidation back below 14,765. Similar action in the month of April too, where primarily the buyers failed initially, and sellers kind of drove and started the one time framing to the downside, but eventually buyers stepped in during the last week to push the market higher. Kind of expected that the buyers should actually close above this level, but again, they failed miserably to get a closing. As long as we stay within the Feb months range, we are likely to continue this choppy price action on both sides. So basically, what we are having is 2 months of indecisive bars. So which suggests that neither the buyers nor the sellers are kind of controlling the auction. But from a higher time frame perspective, these selling tails suggest that we have some strong sellers sitting within this zone who have been using the rallies towards 15,000 and 15,500 to sell into. All right, so on the weekly charts, we've got a nice balance, I think, for about 12 weeks now. And what we had last week was a typical failed auction, and buyers eventually stopped the one time framing to the downside that we had for 3 consecutive weeks and started one time framing to the upside. And one of the interesting aspect that we have is that 4 weeks of action by the sellers has been taken by the buyers in just 1 week. So the action that we had last week was great, and I would have expected buyers to kind of get a closing above 15,000. But again, the sellers stepped in to push the market lower, and this selling tail that we had last week again suggests that we have some presence of strong responsive sellers coming into the market, especially closer to the 15,000 zone. So as long as we stay within this order range of 14,500 and 15,500, the price action is likely to be choppy. There hasn't been great expansion of the volumes, suggesting that again neither the buyers nor the sellers are in control of the auction or haven't been showing any confidence in terms of the direction. So in terms of the daily chart, structure is still intact. So we continue to form lower lows and lower highs. Buyers kind of tried last week to kind of push the market higher and probably form a higher high. But again, they failed. They kind of got restricted at 15,035, just around 10 points below the prior swing high. And something interesting that played out last week was the kind of move that we had, especially prior to the expiry, back of very low or below par volumes. And this action that we had, where the sellers kind of push the markets lower, have some nice expansion in the volumes. So this suggests that the kind of sellers are probably a stronger hands when compared to the buyers. In terms of the trade plan for next week, so we are kind of have a small balance here between 14,155 and 14,700. And interestingly, the market stayed in this balance for about 2 weeks, after which we had a nice breakout and then formed another swing high where the sellers stepped in to push the markets lower. And interestingly, they were successful in able to get a closing back within this balance. The trade plan for next week, if the buyers could step in within this zone and reject the prices back above this balance, then potentially we may have a retest of this zone of 15,035 and 15,045. So this is a zone where we have some supply. Unless the buyers approach this zone of 15,000 and 15,100 and start to find acceptance, the sellers could use all these rallies to sell into. If they are good enough to kind of probe back into this balance and start find acceptance below the 14,600 and 14,500, eventually we are heading towards low end of the balance, which is 14,155. So essentially, we are trading within two broader ranges. So the first range being 14,150 to 14,500. The second trading range is 14,500 to 15,050. So any acceptance below 14,500, eventually we are heading for a retest of 14,150, while buyers defending the zone of 14,500, we may probably head towards the retest of the supply, all the sellers that we have at 15,050, above which I think we are likely to head for a retest of the prior swings at 15,375 and 15,524. However, this requires some strong hand buying because this is a zone where we have some longer time frame sellers, as we have seen on the monthly charts, with some selling tails. So essentially the sideways action continues for the 2 complete months. Something interesting that played out last week was this rally that we had towards the higher end of the balance is backed by some strong longs being built up. So it's interesting to see whether these are strong enough to kind of hold the 14,500 levels and probably push higher for the retest of 15,000 levels yet again, or if they are weak ones, to kind of liquidate like they did on Friday. So in case if you are having more liquidation back below 14,500 and 14,600, all these longs that have built their positions are going to liquidate towards the low end of the balance. So it's an interesting week that we have during the month of May, and especially with the events around. It's interesting to see whether the buyers were able to defend the zone of 14,500 and 14,600. If they do, we are heading back towards 15,000. If not, we are heading for 14,150. So in terms of the demand and the supply zones, so this zone of 15,100 and 15,200 is likely to provide some resistance, while this is an important reference zone that we talked about, so 14,500 to 14,600. So if the buyers get a continuation Friday's action on Monday with a gap down and start to find acceptance within the zone, we are likely to head lower and probably retest the demand within the zone of 14,100 to 14,150. If the buyers are good enough to fund this zone of 14,500, 14,600, we may likely to have a reversal back towards the supply zone of 15,050. All right, so now let's look into the market profile charts and see how the market auctioned last week, and look at the potential scenarios and the references that we would need to consider for the next week's auction. So prior to last week, we had a nice balance. Monday, the market opened right within this balance, tried to kind of auction towards the high end of the balance. So there was quite a bit of struggle on this day where the buyers tried to absorb the supply. The high end of the balance is obviously a zone for supply, while the low end of the balance is where we have the demand. So the buyers that started the auction started towards the high end of the balance, tried to absorb the supply. They were unsuccessful on that particular day, where they couldn't kind of, they tried to probe, however, could not get a follow through and kind of closed back within the balance. However, some strong momentum was seen on the 27th of April, where the market opened pretty much flat towards the close on Monday. However, the buyers this time has got some strong momentum. They pushed the prices right out of this balance immediately and started to find acceptance above the balance. Again, we have this important HVN that was left on the 16th of April, where the buyers kind of struggled and had a small halt, and were able to close the market towards the high point of the day. So this led a higher open, a gap open. Buyers were strong. They continued their strength and started one time framing to the upside, formed a double distribution trend day. So we had number distribution one, distribution two, and eventually closed in the upper distribution. Again, a bullish sort of an auction that we had on the 28th of April. We had a higher open, but interestingly, what happened was that the prices got rejected from the prior swing high, where the buyers started liquidating. So this zone of 15,000 and 15,050 has got some strong sellers. If the buyers want to head higher, they need to take out the responsive sellers in this zone. So as long as they stay, they would sell on every rise towards the 15,000 levels. So we had pretty much a liquidation day. So a range extension below the initial balance. However, it closed pretty much flat as sort of a balance. However, on Friday, we had a lower open, a gap open. Buyers tried to probe into the prior day's range. However, the sellers from the prior day on the 29th of April stepped in towards the point of control. So even the point of control hasn't been tagged, but this HVN, where we had some sellers restricted the buyers from heading higher, that led the liquidation towards the second half and especially into the weekend. Pretty much the buyers liquidated all the way towards the gap zone. So this gap created on the 28th has been totally filled and revisited. How's the market likely to play next week? So we talked about the zone of 14,500 and 14,600. So for starters, if you are looking out for a gap open, so the close that we had on Friday was towards the lowest point of the day. So the expectation as a follow through is a gap down open on Monday. Then this is an important reference to watch out for. So any acceptance within 14,500 and 14,600, we are likely heading lower. And this HVN that had the supply on the 26th of April is likely to act as a demand. This will be an important reference to watch out for if you are holding your longs. So in case if the market finds acceptance below and starts spending time, which essentially means that we are accepting back within this balance and the destination trade would be the lower end of the balance. If the buyers were able to defend the zone, then we are likely to see another reversal or head higher towards retesting of the supply within this zone of 4,900, 15,000, 15,050. All right, so now let's move on to Bank Nifty. The structure on the Bank Nifty is quite weak when compared to Nifty. Unlike Nifty, we've already taken out the Feb lows. The sellers tried to look below the lows of Feb, below the 31,000. However, there was a strong demand that stepped in within this zone of 30,000 and 31,000 that left this strong buying tail. So this suggests that we have some strong demand coming in within the 30,000, 31,000 zone, pushed the market and got a closing above the prior all-time high zone. There is no doubt about it that we had some strong sellers sitting within this zone. So the context still remains sideways to bearish or probably more tilted towards bearish zone. For the context to change, the one time framing to the downside has to be halted and the buyers have to start the one time framing to the upside. So for that to happen, this zone of 34,000 and 35,000 is of strong prominence. So this is a zone where we have some strong sellers sitting. So if these sellers could be taken out, then the one time framing to the downside will be stopped, and then we could start a one time framing to the upside and probably retest the sellers within the 36,000 and 37,000 zone. If we start to find acceptance back below the 32,000, 31,000, we are looking for a retest of the strength of the buyers that approached within this zone are strong enough or not. So any continuation to April's lows, we are eventually heading lower, especially to these lows in December and January. So the structure is weak on a longer time frame. The context will only change once we get a closing above the 34,000, 35,000 levels. All right, so on the weekly charts, we had a 2-day balance from which we got a breakout. However, the sellers, as we just discussed, so this zone of 34,000, 35,000 has got some strong sellers. So this is the zone that the buyers need to target if they were to move higher. So the expected scenario is for the sellers to step in, which they eventually did within this zone when we had the rally into this zone last week, where the buyers stepped in to push lower. So we have got a strong selling tail here, suggests that there are some strong sellers sitting here. So for the buyers to head higher, they need to absorb the supply within the zone of 33,000, 34,000. Otherwise, we are looking for a start of one time framing to the downside yet again. So unlike Nifty, we have an interesting change on the Bank Nifty charts. So we kind of taken out this lower high that we had at 34,250. Highs that we had last week was, I believe, something like 34,290, I guess. So we kind of formed a higher level. Players failed to kind of hold that, and then Eventually, they liquidated for the 2 continuous days, started one time frame to the downside. So similar to Nifty, I think we have a 2 week balance here. So unlike Nifty, we kind of haven't had any close back within this balance. So it is important to understand how the market auctions next week. So the expected scenario is that the buyers would approach within this 2 day balance that was formed towards the high end of balance. So in case if the buyers were able to defend this zone, defend this level of 30 to 500, we are likely to see sort of a reversal back 34,000 levels. The buyers fail miserably and then kind of find acceptance back into this 2 day balance, especially back within this broader balance. Then eventually we are heading for retest of the lower prices, especially some of the weak lows that were left towards the low end of the balance. Similar to Nifty, the up move that we had for these 3 days is backed by some poor volumes, while the sellers is basically with some volume expansion. So the levels for next week, important reference to watch out for is 32,500. So above 32,500, we may head for 34,000 yet again, but below 32,500, we're kind of heading lower, and the acceptance back into this balance is likely to be choppy, but eventually I think we may probably head lower towards the 31,000 and 3,500 levels. So a sort of a rejection here, a halt, and then we started one time framing to the downside. Um, the rally that we had earlier last week was kind of backed by some longs being built up. However, they seem to start liquidating for the last couple of days. So if this continues, then we are likely to head lower. But this HVN at 32,500 is an important reference to watch out for. So if this gets held by the buyers, then we are looking at the higher prices back towards 34,000. If this gets taken out, we are looking for this lower HVN at 3,500, below which we are heading for the prior swing lows of 29,600. All right, so let's now move on to the market profile chart. So similar to Nifty, we have a weekly balance here. On Monday, the market opened right at the balance high. And then similar to Nifty, I think the expected scenario is the supply to appear towards the high end of the balance, which the market did. So we had the supply where the buyers struggled for pretty much the entire day. On the subsequent day, we had pretty much a flat open from where the market opened. In both these instances, the buyers defunded and rejected the prices out of this balance. So if you look at the lows of 26th of April and 27th of April, it's exactly the same. So 32, 150, essentially it is a weak low. So this is an important reference to watch out for, as this is more of mechanical in nature, where the buyers approached at the same exact levels. So on the subsequent day, we had a higher open where we had a massive 1,000 point rally as rather a triple distribution day. Number 1, 2, and 3, and market closed at the high point of the day. We had a gap higher, and there was an open rejection and reverse. However, it was more of a balance where the sellers and buyers got in a balance and closed pretty much at the midpoint of the day. However, on Friday, we had a lower open where the buyers tried to probe into the prior day's range, failed again to find acceptance, where the sellers from this HVN approached to kind of mark the prices lower. So this is a resistance zone to watch out for any upside auction. So the sellers may step in again if prices were to approach this zone. If these sellers gets taken out, we are likely to head for an auction higher. The way the market closed on Friday suggests that we may potentially have a gap down open. So for Monday, we have this small balance. If we were to find acceptance back within this balance, heading for these weak lows that were left at 32,150. So this remains a strong demand zone to watch out for. If this demand is taken out by the sellers, so eventually we are looking at for lower prices. So any acceptance back within this prior balance, we are looking for a retest of the lows of 3450. So an important reference to watch out for Monday is basically 32,500. So if we are to find acceptance below this, we are cleaning up these weak lows below which we are heading lower. If buyers were able to defend the zone of 30 to 500, we may probably have a potential reversal. 32,500 for the retest of the sellers around this HVN of 33,500 and 34,000, above which we are heading for 34,500 and 35,000. That's all for today. Thank you very much for joining and listening. If you find this content useful, please do like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.